At exactly 2:13 p.m. on a cloudy Tuesday, a German shepherd named Ghost let out a bark so sharp it made 3 staff members jump. He was supposed to be on a routine visit with the K9 unit, just a friendly face to comfort the kids at St. Alora's, home for children. But he wasn't wagging his tail, he wasn't sniffing for snacks. Ghost had locked his eyes on a crumbling brick wall in the back of the old storage shed, and he was barking like his life depended on it. No one knew then that what Ghost sensed behind that wall was something no adult in that orphanage had dared to talk about for years. Ghost had been trained as a search and rescue dog, the kind used in disaster zones, collapsed buildings, and forest searches. But after an injury in the field and months of recovery, he was reassigned to community work. Therapy visits, school demonstrations, hospital rounds. What no one realized, until that day, was that Ghost hadn't lost his edge. If anything, his instincts had grown sharper. Officer Melissa Crane, Ghost's handler, knew something was off the moment he stopped walking and stiffened in front of that old brick wall. He crouched low. His ears snapped forward. His tail rose. And then the barking began, short-clipped bursts, not playful at all. This was alert barking. One of the volunteers laughed awkwardly. "Maybe there's a rat in the wall," she said. Ghost barked louder. His paws scratched the floor. He was trying to dig. Melissa knelt beside him and whispered a command. He didn't budge. She stood up and looked around. The shed was half storage, half forgotten. Old boxes, rusted tools, dusty furniture. And that wall, it didn't match the rest of the building. The bricks were newer, out of place, like someone had patched something shut. But this was an orphanage, not a crime scene. At least, not yet. St. Alora's had stood on the edge of town for nearly 70 years. Generations of children passed through its gates. Some found families. Others aged out. Over the past decade, funding had dried up. The building crumbled. Staff rotated like clockwork. There were rumors, always rumors, about how things used to be. How strict one director had been. How a child had gone missing in the late 2010s. But nothing ever stuck. No charges, no press, just silence. Until Ghost showed up. The next day, Melissa brought Ghost back, this time on her own time. She told the new director, Ms. Lydia Parks, that her dog had picked up something strange. Lydia hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the shed window. "We don't use that room anymore," she said. "Just old junk." "Then you won't mind if we check it again?" Melissa replied. Ghost bolted toward the wall the moment the shed door opened. Same wall, same intensity. But this time, Melissa looked closer. She touched the bricks, felt a faint seam. The mortar wasn't aged like the rest. Some of it still crumbled at a single push. "You said this was always here?" "I think so," Lydia said, but her voice cracked. "Honestly, I started here last year. We've had a lot of turnover." Melissa looked her in the eye. "You might want to call the county inspector. If stories like this matter to you, stories of real animals, uncovering truths that people ignored, don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals. We share powerful emotional cases where animals are the reason justice gets done." By Friday morning, a city crew was on site. The building inspector wasn't convinced there was a cavity, but Ghost's behavior was undeniable. Even he admitted it was worth looking into. They brought in a handheld radar scanner. Sure enough, there was a hollow space behind the wall. Everyone cleared the room except the crew. Melissa waited outside with Ghost, who whined and paced the gravel. Then came the sound, a loud thud. Then silence. Then someone cursing. Followed. "So you need to see this." The wall gave way in under 2 hours. Behind it was not what anyone expected. It wasn't just an empty cavity. It was a room, no windows, no light fixtures, just old, dusty blankets, a broken cot, a bucket, and a child. He was curled up in the far corner, arms shielding his face from the daylight. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. He didn't even flinch when the officers approached. He just looked up and stared straight at Ghost. The German shepherd stood at the threshold and let out one low whine, then sat down, head tilted. No one moved. The boy, covered in dirt, his hair matted, his limbs thin like twigs, reached out his hand, and Ghost leaned forward, resting his muzzle in the child's palm. His name was Mason, or at least that's what the worn medical bracelet on his wrist said. He had been reported missing 6 years earlier, 5 years old at the time, taken from the hospital into foster care and never seen again. The case had gone cold, but he never left the building. He had been here, hidden, behind that wall. Ghost was the first living being to truly see him again. Mason didn't speak. Not the next day, not the next week, not even after he was cleaned up, fed, and placed in protective care. Social workers gently encouraged him. Therapists tried drawing, music, touch, but the boy who had survived 6 years in a walled-off room remained silent. Except around Ghost. The German shepherd sat beside him every day in the hospital. Ghost didn't bark, didn't lick. He just lay still, head on his paws, eyes never leaving the boy. And slowly, Mason began to respond. The first time, it was a movement. A little flick of his fingers against Ghost's fur. A week later he began sketching. Nothing complex, circles, shapes, stick figures. But every page had the same image, a brick wall, a black dog, and a small boy curled in the corner. Ghost had been the only one who heard him, the only one who cared enough to dig. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. The county sheriff's office opened a full investigation. Reporters camped outside St. Elora's gates. The state launched an emergency review of the orphanage's operations. Everyone wanted answers. How could a 5-year-old vanish inside a licensed childcare facility? How could no one know he was missing? And the question that kept haunting Melissa Crane: who built that wall? The first lead came from a forgotten file in the county records department. 6 years ago, St. Elora's had reported a maintenance renovation, an emergency structural fix to the rear supply shed. No building permits were filed, no inspections, documented. But a name was listed under project oversight: Charles L. Denton. Melissa froze when she saw it. Denton had been the facilities director for over 20 years. Retired abruptly 3 years prior. He left without fanfare, citing family health issues. But staff remembered him as stern, secretive, and unflinchingly strict. A few remembered something else too. The week Mason disappeared, Denton had said the boy was too unstable for their environment, that he had been transferred to a psychiatric facility under emergency grounds, but no transfer was ever processed. When detectives interviewed Denton at his cabin 3 counties away, he didn't deny knowing Mason. But what he did say chilled everyone in the room. That boy was trouble from day one, he muttered. Kept biting other kids, wouldn't stop screaming. He made the others unsafe. So you locked him in a room? One of the investigators asked. I didn't hurt him, Denton snapped. I gave him food, water, I checked in weekly. He was better off in there. He was quiet. No remorse. No understanding of the horror he'd inflicted. Just cold justification. The arrest warrant was issued that same afternoon. But the real damage ran deeper than one man. Records revealed that staff turnover during the last decade had been abnormally high. Most only lasted 6 to 8 months. No centralized reporting, no exit interviews. Complaints went missing. A handful of former employees began to speak up. I heard noises in that shed, I swear, said one. But Denton said it was raccoons. Another admitted she thought the child had run away. He was so small. I remember how scared he looked the last day I saw him. No one had followed up. No one had demanded proof. And over the years, Mason's name simply faded. Ghost had done in 3 minutes what a building full of adults failed to do in 6 years. The state ordered the orphanage shut down pending further investigation. All remaining children were relocated. Social workers combed through every file, rechecking each child's records, cross-referencing adoption claims, even matching names to national missing persons databases. They found more discrepancies. Nothing as horrifying as Mason's case, but enough to suggest long-term neglect, potential abuse, and systemic failures from top to bottom. St. Alora's was finished. Meanwhile, Mason was healing, in his own way. He wouldn't sleep unless Ghost was nearby, wouldn't eat unless Ghost was in the room. Melissa got special permission to keep Ghost with the boy 24/7, including at the trauma care facility. One afternoon, a child psychologist brought in colored pencils and laid them out in front of Mason. He stared for a while, unmoving, then reached for the red one. He drew a door, a handle, and something small under it. When asked what it was, Mason didn't speak, but he looked at Ghost. The dog stood up, slowly walked toward the exit, then looked back. Melissa felt it in her gut. "There's more," she whispered. 2 days later, investigators returned to the orphanage grounds. The original bricked room was cleared and documented, but Ghost led them beyond it, to the main house, to the west hallway. To a door painted the same color as the walls, almost invisible if you weren't looking closely. Ghost scratched at the base. Inside, they found a crawl space, and inside the crawl space, 2 broken toys, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a tiny blanket with Mason's initials. They weren't sure if it had been an earlier hiding spot or a failed escape attempt, but it painted a clearer picture. This wasn't just neglect, it was psychological torture. Melissa watched Mason play with Ghost in the hospital courtyard a week later. He didn't smile, not really, but he made a sound, a tiny breathy noise when Ghost gently dropped a tennis ball in his lap. The first vocal noise they'd heard from him. Melissa blinked back tears. "He's coming back," she whispered. In the following weeks, the story spread nationwide. News networks called it the orphanage wall case. Editorials demanded stricter oversight of group homes. Animal lovers across the country sent treats, letters, even framed drawings of Ghost. Donations poured in to fund new canine therapy teams for at-risk children. But to Melissa, none of that mattered. More than this. A little boy had been buried alive in silence, and one dog heard his voice even when no one else could. The first word Mason spoke came on a Tuesday. It was short, soft, barely louder than a breath. "Stay." He said it when Ghost got up to leave the hospital room for his nightly break. The moment Ghost turned toward the door, Mason reached out, fingers trembling, and said it again, this time louder. "Stay." Melissa froze in the hallway. She had heard it too. The therapist standing beside her slowly lowered her clipboard. "That's it," she whispered. "That's his first word." But it wasn't just a word. It was a plea, a command, a need. It was the sound of a boy who had lived in complete silence for 6 years, finally trusting someone enough to ask them not to leave. And of course, Ghost stayed. Over the next few weeks, Mason's recovery began in fragments, small pieces that only made sense when seen together. He didn't talk much, but he pointed now. He drew more. His sketches became clearer. A figure standing in a hallway, a red door with no handle, a small bed surrounded by darkness. Always the black dog appeared in the corner, glowing eyes and calm posture. Ghost had become his anchor. Melissa watched, carefully. She didn't push. Neither did the doctors. They understood trauma doesn't operate on a schedule. It comes and goes like weather. Some days Mason sat in silence for hours, barely blinking. Other days he'd follow Ghost around the hospital, his little hand gripping the dog's tactical vest like it was a lifeline. Ghost never pulled away. He adjusted to Mason's pace like they'd trained together their whole lives. One morning, Melissa took Mason for a short walk through the nearby community park. Ghost, of course, came along. It was crisp out, early fall in Northern Virginia. Leaves scattered across the sidewalk in rust-colored piles. A group of kids rode bikes along the fence. Mason flinched at the sound of laughter. His eyes scanned the group, his hand gripping Ghost's vest tighter. "It's okay," Melissa said softly, crouching beside him. "They're just playing." Mason didn't answer, but his hand slowly loosened. Ghost gave a quiet chuff, like a dog's version of reassurance, and then Mason did something he hadn't done yet. He reached down and picked up a fallen leaf. Bright yellow, almost gold. He looked at it for a long moment, then handed it to Melissa without saying a word. It was such a small gesture, but it meant he was noticing the world again. That night, Melissa got a call from the district attorney's office. They wanted her and Ghost to attend the preliminary hearing for Charles Denton's indictment. The state wanted to show that Mason had support, visible, powerful support. Ghost wasn't just a search and rescue dog anymore. He was the face of a case that had shaken the system. Melissa hesitated. She didn't want to re-traumatize Mason. But when she asked the therapist, they gave her a surprising answer. Let Mason decide. So she did. She asked him the next morning. Simple and slow. "There's a big meeting about you. A courtroom. The man who hurt you will be there. Do you want to come?" Mason didn't speak. He simply looked at Ghost. Then he nodded. The courtroom was quiet. Too quiet. The gallery was full. Reporters, state officials, a few tearful former staff members. Denton sat at the defense table, expression flat, hands folded. The judge called the room to order, and that's when the door opened. Mason entered, holding Ghost's vest with one hand and Melissa's hand with the other. The room didn't gasp, but the shift in energy was palpable. This wasn't just a victim. This was a survivor. The hearing was procedural. Statements read, evidence outlined. But when the prosecutor referenced Ghost by name, Mason did something no one expected. He stood up. He turned to the judge. And for the first time in public, he spoke. "He found me," he said. He didn't leave. Just 5 words. But they echoed in that courtroom like thunder. Denton looked away. The judge paused, visibly shaken. Melissa felt her heart pounding. Ghost stayed by Mason's side, still and calm. That moment didn't just shift the case. It shattered any remaining doubt that what happened to Mason had been real and unforgivable. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Melissa shielded Mason, careful not to overwhelm him. But Ghost, he stood tall, like a statue carved from loyalty. Cameras flashed. Headlines rolled. Boy who survived orphanage prison. Speaks for first time. Thanks to dog hero. Canine dog Ghost leads justice for silent victim. The story went national, again, and this time, it stuck. A week later, Melissa received a letter. It was from a woman named Elena. She was now 32, married, living in Oregon. She'd once lived at St. Elora's, early 2000s. She remembered that hallway, remembered the red door, and she remembered being punished for asking about the boy who cried all night. Elena had believed for years that she'd imagined it. But now, she knew it was real. More letters followed. Former residents, staff, volunteers, all sharing stories they'd kept buried for decades. Some recalled screaming behind the walls. Others remembered bruises that went unexplained. No one had ever spoken out before. But now, because of a dog named Ghost and a boy brave enough to say stay, they were finding their voices. Mason's progress accelerated. He began using words. Simple at first, then fuller sentences. He laughed once and it startled the entire trauma unit. He even asked if Ghost could sleep in his room overnight. something previously not allowed due to hospital policy. They made an exception. That night he slept through until morning for the first time. Melissa knew their time together would eventually shift. Mason would be placed with a permanent family, or in a long-term care program that suited his healing. But Ghost's bond with him was something deeper than therapy. It was something spiritual, unspoken, pure. She talked to the program director, then to the judge, and finally, to Mason. "Would you want to live with Ghost forever?" she asked gently. Mason looked up. He didn't answer right away. But then, he smiled and nodded. 2 months later, adoption paperwork was finalized. Melissa became Mason's legal guardian. Ghost became his full-time protector, friend, and family. And St. Alora's? It was bulldozed. Every brick, every corridor, every shadowy room. In its place, the state built a memorial park for children who had fallen through the cracks. The centerpiece was a bronze statue of a boy and a German shepherd, standing side by side facing the horizon. The plaque read, "For the ones who were forgotten, and the one who heard them." Every morning now began the same way. Ghost would nudge Mason's bedroom door open at precisely 6:47 a.m., never earlier, never later, walk to the edge of the bed, and wait. Mason, still half asleep but smiling, would reach out and rest his hand on Ghost's head. Then, slowly, he'd sit up, swing his legs over the side of the bed, and whisper the same phrase. "We're still here." It had become their little ritual, their way of grounding the day. Not everyone understood what it meant, but Melissa did. After everything they had been through, the wall, the trial, the silence, those words were Mason's declaration of survival. He wasn't lost anymore. He wasn't hidden behind bricks. He was living, breathing, waking up in a real home, with someone who would never leave, and Ghost had known. Somehow, long before the world caught up, Ghost had understood what that boy needed most: to be seen. Life wasn't perfect, of course. Trauma doesn't evaporate just because the world starts clapping. Mason still had bad nights. Sometimes, thunder made him cry. Sometimes loud voices triggered him. He refused to enter elevators. He wouldn't walk into rooms without a visible window. The psychologist called them control anchors, spaces he couldn't emotionally trust, but every time the shadows came, Ghost was there. Sometimes all it took was the dog resting his head on Mason's lap. Other times, Ghost would nudge Mason gently until he moved away from the wall, or the corner or the closet he had slipped into. No words, just presence. Melissa watched it again and again. It wasn't therapy. It was love. One afternoon, as the leaves began to turn, Melissa received an invitation in the mail. It was from the National Canine Service Hall of Honor in Chicago. They wanted to recognize Ghost with a Lifetime Service Medal, not just for his work with Mason, but for his overall career. Years in search and rescue, disaster response, and finally, the uncovering of what media outlets had come to call the orphanage wall tragedy. Melissa read the letter twice, unsure what to feel. She had never been the kind of person who chased recognition. But this wasn't about her. This was about Ghost, and the boy who had found his voice beside him. They flew to Chicago the following week. Mason had never been on a plane before. He gripped the seat tightly during takeoff, but Ghost's calm, grounded breathing seemed to settle him. He fell asleep halfway through the flight, curled up with Ghost's paw under his arm. The ceremony was held in a grand theater near Navy Pier. Hundreds of people filled the seats: handlers, veterans, police officers, and children holding plush K9 dolls. Ghost was introduced last. When his name was called, the entire crowd stood. Melissa and Mason walked up together. Mason held Ghost's leash with a quiet pride, wearing a navy blue suit and sneakers with cartoon dogs on the sides. Teatro. Presenter leaned into the microphone. Some dogs serve. Some dogs protect, and some change lives. Ghost didn't just find a boy. He gave him back a future, and in doing so, reminded all of us what loyalty really means. The applause was thunderous. Mason didn't flinch. He stepped forward, reached up, and gently fastened the medal around Ghost's neck. And then, breaking character for the first time, Ghost let out a single, deep bark. The room exploded in laughter and tears. After the ceremony, they visited the lakefront. The breeze was cool, and the water shimmered in the late afternoon sun. Melissa sat on a bench watching Mason toss a stick into the water. Ghost, true to form, didn't chase it. He just sat beside the boy, watching it drift. "You ever wonder?" Melissa said quietly. "What made him go to that wall?" A woman nearby, a retired canine trainer, overheard her and turned. "Dogs don't follow orders when it comes to people they feel," she said. "They feel need, grief, pain, especially dogs like Ghost. He wasn't alerting to danger, he was answering a call no one else could hear." Melissa looked back at Mason. He was laughing now. Not loud but light like wind through trees. The sound still startled her sometimes. In the best way. Back home, things settled into a rhythm. Mason started attending a hybrid school program. Part-time in person, part-time remote. He worked with an educational therapist who specialized in delayed speech and trauma recovery. Ghost was granted a special handler pass to accompany him into the classroom, and every kid in the room wanted to sit next to Mason. Not because they pitied him, but because Ghost was cool. One day, during art class, Mason painted something different. It wasn't another wall or another door. It was a house, a small white house with a red roof. In front, a dog with a gold medal, and a boy holding a ball. The teacher asked what it was. Mason simply said, "Us." Later that week, Melissa found Mason sitting on the back porch, legs swinging, Ghost at his feet. He was staring at the sunset. "You okay, buddy?" she asked. He nodded. "I was just thinking." "About what?" He looked down at Ghost, then back at the sky. "Do you think Ghost knew I was there before we got there?" Melissa sat beside him, unsure how to answer. "I think," she said slowly, "Ghost knows things before the rest of us do, especially about people who feel alone." Mason was quiet for a while, then whispered, "I don't feel alone anymore." One night, months later, after the story had faded from the headlines, Melissa received a message on Facebook. It was from a woman in Georgia. She'd just adopted a 9-year-old boy from a group home, non-verbal, aggressive outbursts. The staff had given up, but after watching a video about Ghost and Mason, she'd brought a rescue dog into the house. She wrote, "I don't know if it'll work, but tonight, for the first time, he let the dog sit beside him. No screaming, no hitting, just sat there. Thank you for giving us hope." Melissa stared at the screen, tears in her eyes. Ghost hadn't just changed one life. He was rippling through the world like light through cracks in old walls. And so they kept going. One morning at a time. One bark, one leaf, one whispered word at a time. The boy who once lived behind a wall now ran through open fields, his voice soft but certain. The dog who found him, Ghost, was still by his side. Not just as a hero, but as proof that sometimes the ones who save us don't speak at all. By spring, the snow had melted, and the quiet town where Mason and Melissa now lived began to bloom again. The yard behind their small white house filled with daffodils, wild grass, and the laughter of a boy who had once been too afraid to raise his voice. His giggle floated across the fence as he and Ghost chased each other in slow, gentle loops, a game that had become their after-school ritual. Melissa stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching them with a mixture of pride and awe. This ordinary, peaceful scene felt like a miracle. Mason had grown taller over the past few months, though still lean, still a little guarded around strangers. He rarely talked in big crowds, but at home, with Ghost beside him, his voice had taken on a quiet confidence. He had questions now, big ones. Why do people do bad things to kids? Do you think I would have been okay if Ghost didn't find me? Do dogs go to heaven? Melissa never had perfect answers, but she never pretended to. Instead, she'd sit with him under the old oak tree in the backyard and tell him the truth, piece by piece, in a language he could understand. Sometimes the truth came in stories, sometimes in hugs, sometimes just in letting him talk through the questions out loud until they weren't so scary anymore. And Ghost? Ghost listened to everything. The story of Mason and Ghost was no longer front-page news, but it hadn't faded completely. Every few weeks, Melissa received a letter or email from someone who had watched the original documentary or heard about the courtroom testimony. Some were parents. Some were social workers. Some were kids. All of them shared a common thread, the sense that they weren't alone anymore. One message came from a group home in Ohio, where a staffer introduced a therapy dog for the first time. Another from a family in Arizona, whose foster son slept through the night for the first time in years, with a German shepherd curled up at the foot of his bed. The reach of Ghost's quiet heroism was spreading, not through force or fame, but through connection. Then came the call that changed everything. It was from the Department of Health and Human Services. They wanted Melissa and Mason to join a pilot program. The idea was to introduce certified therapy dogs like Ghost into group homes, orphanages, and transitional facilities for kids with trauma. The project would be called Project Ghostlight, named after the idea that in theaters, a single bulb is left on when the stage is dark, to keep the space alive. Ghostlight would aim to do the same for children whose lives had gone dim. Melissa hesitated. She wasn't sure Mason was ready for that kind of visibility again, but when she asked him about it, he looked down at Ghost, then back at her, and said, something she hadn't heard before. I think it might help someone like me. That was all she needed. The pilot launched quietly. 3 dogs, 3 homes, 2 trainers per site. Melissa helped design the safety protocols and routines. Mason didn't speak at the press events, but he attended, always with Ghost at his side. Kids connected with the dogs in ways even the staff hadn't anticipated. Some of the most withdrawn teens opened up after just a few days. One girl who hadn't spoken in 4 months began reading to her dog every night before bed. Ghost wasn't stationed at any facility full-time. He had earned his retirement, but he and Mason visited once a month as special guests. Everywhere they went, kids swarmed them. Not because of the story, but because Ghost made them feel safe. Mason didn't tell them everything, but sometimes, if he saw someone sitting alone, looking lost the way he once had, he'd sit beside them and say, Ghost is really good at finding people who feel invisible. And then, like magic, Ghost would lay down, press his side against theirs, and just stay. That summer, Melissa received a letter with a gold seal. It was from the office of the governor. They were awarding Ghost the Medal of Civilian Bravery, one of the highest honors given to a non-military service animal in the state. The ceremony would be held at the Capitol, with Mason invited as the featured speaker. Melissa wasn't sure if he'd accept, but Mason surprised her again. He stood in front of the mirror the night before, practicing with a small note card. His hands shook. He forgot words. He cried once, but he kept practicing. I'm doing it for Ghost, he said quietly. The next day, under bright blue skies and a soft summer breeze, Mason stepped up to the podium. The room was full. State officials, journalists, teachers, children, veterans. Cameras clicked, reporters leaned forward. Ghost sat in front of the stage, tail still, eyes fixed on Mason. Mason took a deep breath. and began. I used to live in a place where no one could hear me, he said. I thought I would never be found. But Ghost, he heard me. Even when I didn't make a sound. His voice wavered, but he didn't stop. I think there are kids out there right now who feel like I did. I want them to know they're not invisible. Someone is looking for them. And maybe that someone has fur. The room erupted in applause. Melissa cried silently in the front row. Ghost barked once, just once, and wagged his tail. That night, back at home, Melissa tucked Mason into bed. You were brave today, she said. So was Ghost. He always is. There was a pause. Then Mason asked, Do you think I'll always need him? Melissa smiled. No, I think one day you won't. Mason looked worried. Will he be sad if I don't? No, she said softly. Ghost wants you to grow. He'll always be proud of you no matter what. That's what love is. Mason nodded, curling under the blanket. Ghost lay down beside the bed. And as the room dimmed, Mason whispered one last thing. I think I want to help people when I grow up. Melissa kissed his forehead. You already are. The house was quiet that morning. Just the soft clinking of cereal in a bowl and the gentle shuffle of paws on hardwood. Mason, now 10, sat at the kitchen table, a pencil in one hand and a piece of lined paper in front of him. He wasn't drawing this time. He was writing. Carefully, slowly, with each letter spelled out in his head before it hit the page. Melissa watched from the doorway, trying not to interfere. She'd learned that sometimes the best way to help was to simply give him space. Ghost lay nearby, eyes half closed, his body stretched out on the rug. He wasn't as quick as he used to be. He didn't leap into the truck like he once did. But he was still Ghost, watchful, wise, and quietly powerful. After a few minutes, Mason looked up. Can I read this at school today? Melissa smiled. You sure you're ready? I want them to know. The essay was for a class project. The prompt: write about someone who changed your life. Most kids chose teachers or parents or sports heroes. Mason chose Ghost. He stood at the front of the classroom later that morning, holding the paper with both hands. His voice trembled at first, but as he read, it steadied. I didn't used to talk, he began. Not because I didn't know how. Because I thought no one would hear me. I lived behind a wall. Not just a real one, but the kind that makes you feel like you don't matter. He glanced toward the classroom door where Melissa and Ghost were waiting silently. But one day someone found me. Not a person, a dog. His name is Ghost. He barked at a wall until people listened. He brought me back, and now I get to be here, writing, speaking, living. The room was silent when he finished. Then, one by one, the kids clapped. Not because they were told to, but because they felt it. Over the next year, life found a kind of rhythm. Mason went to school full-time. He joined an art club. He started helping Melissa with weekend workshops for Project Ghostlight, now operating in 6 states, and he did something no one expected. He asked for a second dog, not to replace Ghost, but to train under him. That summer, they adopted a 1-year-old German Shepherd mix from a rescue shelter. Her name was Luna, and she was all legs and energy, a chaotic blur of ears and joy. Ghost tolerated her like a wise old mentor, never too stern, but always in control. Mason took to her immediately. He fed her, walked her, read books to her at night. And slowly he began using commands he'd learned from Melissa. Sit, stay, focus. He even built a small obstacle course in the backyard using buckets and PVC pipe. Ghost helped me, he said one evening, rubbing Luna's belly. Now I want to help someone else. Melissa's heart swelled with a mix of joy and bittersweet ache. Ghost had saved a life, and now that life was paying it forward. Time, of course, kept moving. Ghost aged gracefully, but the signs were there. Slower to get, More naps, less chasing tennis balls and more lying in the sun. Melissa scheduled regular checkups, made his food by hand, kept his favorite blanket in the car at all times. She knew what was coming, but she also knew not to speak it aloud. One crisp October morning, Ghost didn't get up with the alarm. Mason found him curled in the corner of the room, breathing slow and shallow. His eyes opened when Mason whispered his name. Ghost wagged his tail once, then let out a long, quiet sigh, and closed his eyes for the last time. They buried him under the big oak tree in the backyard, the same tree where Mason had once sat drawing his first pictures again, where he whispered his first full sentences, where Ghost had always rested, alert and present, as if guarding something sacred. Mason placed Ghost's service medal on a smooth stone they'd chosen as a headstone. On it they etched just 4 words. He heard me first. No dates, no grand title, just truth. Mason didn't speak much for a few days. Melissa gave him space, but she worried. Then, on the 3rd night, he came downstairs with a journal. I wrote something, he said, for Ghost. He opened it and read. Some people think dogs don't understand us, but Ghost did. He didn't need words. He just knew. When no one else came, he came. And now I want to be like that for someone else. Melissa wrapped her arms around him and held him until they both stopped crying. In the years that followed, Mason did exactly what he promised. By 14, he was volunteering at a local shelter. By 16, he was training with certified canine handlers. And at 17, he started his own nonprofit called Echo's Paw, named for the idea that love leaves an echo long after it's gone. The group paired rescue dogs with children from high-risk homes and trained them together, one helping the other heal. Melissa served on the board. Luna became a certified companion animal. And Mason, he became the kind of person Ghost would have been proud of. At the grand opening of their first training facility, Mason stood behind a podium, older now, taller, but still soft-spoken, and said, I used to live behind a wall, and now, because of a dog who believed in me, I help others climb over theirs. The journey that began with one bark and a crumbling brick wall had grown into a movement, a reminder that no voice is too quiet to matter, that sometimes the strongest heroes walk on 4 legs, and that healing doesn't always come with fanfare. It comes in quiet mornings, shared silence, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his dog. Thank you for joining us on this journey, from the very first bark to the very last goodbye. Your presence has meant the world. We'd love to know, what moment in this story touched you the most? And have you ever had an animal change your life in an unexpected way? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Heroes for Animals, because sometimes the greatest heroes have paws.